ये हाथ सलामत है जब तक इस खून में हरारत है, जब तक इस दिल में सदाकत है, जब तक इस मुल्क में ताकत है, जब तक इन ताक़ों सलासिल को हम तो सिखलाएंगे शोरिश बरबतों ने, वो शोरिश जिसके आगे ज़बान हंगामा तबले कैसरों के, हंगामा तबले कैसरों के। आज़ाद है अपने फिक्रो अमल भरपूर खज़ीने।
Hello, everyone. Today, I bring to you a dialogue with the executive editor of Force magazine, Ghazala Wahab. Her magazine is dedicated to national security issues. She's also an author of several books, amongst them, Dragon on Our Doorstep, Managing China Through Military Power, The Peacemakers, and more recently, Born a Muslim, Some Truths About Islam in India. We talk about her experience of growing up in a well-to-do Muslim family. She talks about how she never thought about herself as a Muslim until she was forced to wear the politics of 1980s. She talks about her despair and her hope. So, over to Ghazala.
Please go ahead.
Hello, Ghazala. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very, very interesting conversation. Kudos to you that you read so much and you manage to prepare for your interviews with such diverse group of people.
Well,
Economists, historians, social activists.
yes. I think it's giving me a sense of purpose in a very gloomy kind of a era. And
Don't say gloomy.
Sorry?
Don't say gloomy. I mean, that makes it sound like we have already reached the end of the road.
No, it's not. Okay, I stand corrected. But I think it is quite it's not the kind of atmosphere in which I grew up.
That's true.
It doesn't feel as free. It doesn't, and not just to me, but like, look what happened to these journalists last week. Like,
that's true.
yeah, so, and this is like, we take that freedom for granted and now we have to fight for it.
Absolutely. These are really very, very strange times. I mean, it's almost surreal. Could never imagine that something like this could happen in India.
So I have kind of a good background to frame my questions. So let me start with a little framing.
Okay.
I don't know if I mentioned, but I have studied psychology, anthropology, sociology as a part of my graduate school work. And I don't remember who, but somebody at one point said that truth is an amalgamation of multiple illusions.
So that's very interesting.
And essentially then that was like a punchline, but what he elaborated was that there isn't one truth, there are perspectives. And then when multiple perspectives meet, the truth sits somewhere in between. And so what I'm saying is there are these multiple perspectives, your own perspective of who you are, who you want to be. Then there are other community members of the Muslim community who have their own image and their environment in which they see themselves as a part of that community. And then there are people of other religions, specifically Hindus, who are now like radicalized, who see you in your form, Ghazala, as, as a person who comes from an educated kind of urban background, and they have a certain impression, but when they look at other Muslims, they have another perception of them. And there is this whole muddle of people forming opinions and people forming perceptions. And that gets in the way of just really understanding people for who they are and who they want to become. So essentially what I want to discuss today is how are these perceptions and identities evolved for yourself, for your family, and in the society?
My identity, let's start with the identity first. My identity or self-identity as a person, as a human being, has always been that of Indian, and progressively as an Indian woman. Because if you have any background to what being a woman in India means, then you'll understand from where I'm coming from. There are a lot of social construct which puts women, irrespective of the religion, in a certain kind of a box, and you are expected to operate within that given space which has been provided to you. And this is not really a factor of religion. It is more a factor of your social standing in the society. So a woman who comes from a business family would have a certain space to maneuver her way around. A woman who comes in background would have a different space, or a woman who comes from a really impoverished background would have a different space to maneuver her way around. So I came from a reasonably privileged background, a family which was involved in a business of reasonable means. So my social conditioning was such that there were certain roles expected of me, and that was that I would do my education, I would get married into another business family, and lead a life of a reasonable prosperity, but within those confines, subsuming my own identity into the identity of the new family. So this was the kind of a mental makeup I had when I was growing up. This is what I had seen in my family, women in my family, them operating within these parameters. I had no Muslim friends when I was growing up. All my friends were either Hindu or Sikh, and all of them came from business background, and all of them were operating within the same parameters. So I did not really think that I was different from them in any way, because they all were from the business families. They also knew that they have to finish their education, get married, settle down to domestic bliss, raise children, and throw parties. So that was my first self-identity when I was growing up. The element of being a Muslim and identifying myself as a Muslim came much later, and it wasn't until the late 1980s, when the whole Babri Masjid movement kind of blew over, and there were hateful speeches all over. There were public meetings being held, and that was the first time I realized that in addition to being an Indian woman, an Indian woman of certain means, I was also a Muslim woman. And though I did not have problems with my school friends while growing up, but I was extra conscious of this new layer that had been added to my identity. So that was the second aspect of how I saw myself. But despite this Muslim identity being thrust on me, and I suddenly realizing that I'm a Muslim, I never thought that there was any reason to feel grateful for the kind of privileges I was enjoying in India. I always took them for granted, and I always took them as my right as a citizen of India. I never thought that I could be looked upon as outsider, as part of the invading brigades. So it was only much later that I realized that within these small boxes that I had put myself in, and I was struggling to break out of, there was an additional box that was being thrust upon me, whereby I had to decide whether I was Babar ki aulad, which is part of the invaders, or whether I was a convert from a Dalit Indian community. So I found myself facing these questions. Some people asked me on my face, so did you come from outside, or were you converts? And I had no clue about whether we came from outside or whether we were converts, because as far as my family's history went and as far as their memory went, because nobody writes on the families, at least they did not in my family. So as far as my father's memory went, till his great grandfather, all of them have been living in the same place in Agra where I grew up. I mean, we have been remarkably immobile family. We did not see any mobility anywhere. Nobody moved out of our place of birth. So I found myself facing much later in the early. Suddenly, this became very popular, that Muslims are either outsiders or they are local converts. They were not regular Indians. Both these identities needed intervention. So if you are outsider, then you had to accept that you are outsider and accept that, okay, so now please give us space in this country. Or if you were insider and you were a Dalit or you were a scheduled caste and or a low caste Hindu and you have converted to Islam, then come back, do ghar wapsi. And we are all Indians. Everybody born in India is a Hindu. So you are like the rest of Hindus. You just have to find your way back. So this dichotomy of your identity immediately placed you as separate from what the mainstream was, which is not correct. Because everybody who lives in India is an Indian. And considering that India itself is a nation which comprises people from all nationalities, all various religions, various languages, various eating habits, culinary habits. I mean, we are a hugely diverse nation. Saying that only these are original Indians or native Indians, everybody else is either an imposter or an outsider or an invader, it's incorrect. It's not only, it's historically wrong.
I have a question here.
Yeah.
These questions that you were being asked, were there actually people who you knew who were asking you those questions, or were these questions being asked in the media?
I was personally also asked these questions by people who thought they were well-meaning, who wanted to understand a little more about Indian Muslims. So these questions were asked to me personally as well. They were being asked in the media. They were being asked in a lot of public rhetoric, speeches being made by select politicians. So the decade of 1990s was the one in which I think Indians were struggling with placing themselves in a place where they would be most comfortable. And I think this whole idea of who is Indian, who is not Indian, solidified in this decade. It was, in that sense, a very determinative decade in our history. I mean, since independence, a lot of times there were issues about Muslims being the fifth columnists or Muslims being sympathetic towards Pakistan or they being Pakistani agents in India. All these questions were asked during communal violence. Or this was part of French rhetoric. But the decade of 1990s made this mainstream. Very respectable writers, authors, columnists had started dabbling into this issue, these questions. So this was, in my understanding, a very definitive decade in our history. It did not help that we had this huge insurgency raging in Kashmir, which again put Muslims in the kind of docks, because though we never thought that Kashmir had anything to do with Indian Muslims. But in the 1990s, because there were a lot of terrorist attacks on mainland India as well, until the early years of the decade of 2000. So suddenly the Muslims were officially the other. There were organizations like this SIMI, Student Islamic Movement of India. Then there was Indian Mujahideen, a group which broke away from SIMI. SIMI was Student Islamic Movement of India. Yeah. So there were these organizations which I would say, at least for SIMI, was a radical organization, but not so much a terrorist organization. They were pushed into, or they were bracketed as a terrorist organization because of various reasons. But it was surely an organization which was exclusivist and radical.
Can you quickly explain the difference between radicalized and terrorist organization?
I would say a terrorist organization would be an organization or a group of people who carry out acts of violence against ordinary citizens, and a radicalized organization would be a group of people who believe in their exclusive thinking, who are not willing to integrate with the mainstream, who are very radically conservative in their thinking, but they're not carrying out acts of violence. So they're extremely exclusivist. They do not think that they should belong to the mainstream. So I think there was a stage at which Student Islamic Movement of India was dabbling in these things, these kind of ideology. And I have done a little bit of work on this subject in my earlier book, which is called Dragon on Our Doorstep. And I'd spoken with one of the former presidents of SIMI. And he mentioned to me that after the violence in Bombay, post-Babri Masjid violence in Bombay, a lot of shady characters started visiting the SIMI outfits all over India, with radical material, showing them texts and photographs and telling them, look, this is the state of the Muslims in India. Why aren't you doing something about it? And this gentleman, who was then the president of the Maharashtra chapter, he said, at that stage, I decided to leave the organization because it was not what it used to be. So basically, even at that point, there were people within this organization who made a distinction between radical thinking and radical acts. So I think that is a dividing line between what would be a terrorist organization and what would not be a terrorist organization. India, if you are looking at parallel, then a lot of Hindutva organizations, I would call them hugely radical organizations. In fact, I'll go to the extent of calling some of them terrorist organizations too. But a lot of organizations affiliated with the RSS, I would refer to them as hugely radicalized, because they again believe in a very exclusive thinking. They do not think that others are fit to cohabit with them. So that thing is obviously the precursor to terrible violence. RSS is one of the most divisive organizations in India, and it has not suddenly become divisive. I think the founding parameters of the organization in 1925-24 itself were very divisive. If you look at the history of the RSS, it was formed on very divisive grounds. I meet a lot of people who tell me that, look, the beginning or the origin of divisiveness, of Hindu-Muslim divisiveness, goes back to Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and him going to the British Governor General and telling him that, look, Hindus and Muslims cannot stay together and we need to empower Muslims. I do not agree with this, not because I have a soft corner for Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. If you read in my book, I'm hugely critical about him. So it's not because of any soft corner for him, but I disagree with this premise that the seeds of divisiveness lay at his doorstep. I think the seeds of divisiveness, we have to go slightly back in the history, and we have to go back to 1857. Now, what happened in 1857 was that the Muslims were notionally the ruling power in India, and they waged this war of independence against the British. So it was basically Muslims against the British. There were a lot of Hindus also who joined in the 1857 War of Independence. They mobilized under the banner of a Muslim king. Though he was Muslim only in the name, Bahadur Shah Zafar was as egalitarian as you can find any ruler. But notionally, he was a Muslim king, Muslim emperor. And this war was also called jihad by a lot of Muslim clergy in Delhi. And they thought that this was a jihad against the British, in which Hindus and Muslims were joining forces to throw them out. A lot of Hindus also at that point agreed to fight under the banner of jihad, because they thought the goal or the objective was larger. But what happened was, there were a group of people amongst the Hindus in Delhi at that point who felt that why should we spill our blood? Let Muslims and Christians fight this over, and we will get to enjoy the spoils. So they were basically tackling against the jihadis or the freedom fighters, which comprised both Hindus and Muslims, to the British. I mean, this is all part of recorded history, and I have put a bit of this in my book, Born a Muslim, also. If you read William Dalrymple's book, if you read so many other books, you will find it. This is a historically recorded event. So after this war was over, British won and the Mughals lost. I mean, whatever was left of the Mughals. The large-scale reprisal were faced by the Muslims, because they were seen as the leaders of this rebellion. At that point, the powerful Hindus, the merchants, the money lenders of Delhi, they immediately joined up with the British, and because this is what they thought, that once the Mughals are out of the way, then we can be powerful again. And they supported and they enabled the establishment of the British rule in Delhi. Because of this, there was a huge cleavage between the two communities, which had found ways of living together, cohabiting together, coexisting together, even if they were not eating out of each other's plates, and even if they were not marrying into each other's families. But there was no divisiveness at the social level. They were cohabiting together. So now this huge rift was created after 1857, in which the Muslims found themselves being opposed by both Hindus and the British, and they were pushed into the corner. In this picture, Sayyid Ahmad Khan emerged, and he said, no, the Muslims and Hindus can't live together, because look at the way Hindus have behaved. So we need to empower the Muslims through education. So that is how he got funding, he got land, and he established this in Aligarh, which eventually transformed into a university. But he was not involved in politics. Even much after, many years after his death, the group of educated Muslims from Aligarh, they formed a group called Aligarhian Group, and they formed a group to lobby the British. Even then, they were not interested in politics. The politics part came much later, when this group transformed into the Muslim League in 1905 or 1906. I'm bad with dates, but the dates are mentioned in my book. So that is when the politics part of it came, and they started lobbying for more and more Muslim rights, including separate electorates and various things. So that Muslim-specific politics started much after Sayyid Ahmad Khan's death. So now to say that he was the founder of this divisiveness is not correct. Now, the RSS actually started as a reactionary organization because it felt that Muslims were physically very strong. And if there's one Hindu who kind of confronts a Muslim, he's likely to be defeated or he's likely to be subdued. But a group of Hindus, if they confront a Muslim, it is possible for them to overpower him. That is when he decided, Mr. Heglewar, that we need to consolidate Hindus in a group. What he didn't envisage was that this group would be a mob, a future mob. So his first experiment was during the Ram Navami festival, a mob of or a group of Hindus, they took out a procession, went and stopped outside the mosque where the Muslims were coming out, and they heckled and they fought with them. And they managed to overpower the Muslims who ran away because they couldn't face this group of Hindus. So Mr. Heglewar was convinced that this is where our strength lies. Our strength lies in consolidation of our power, and then we can face up to the Muslims. And that is the origin of the RSS, which has been recorded in all the books that have been written on the RSS. That their strength lies in consolidating the Hindus in a group. Over time, that group became a mob. And if you see this playbook, all the early riots in India that have happened, they all started around the Hindu festival, whether it was Ram Navami, whether it was some yatra or the other. The beginning was always a festival on which they got together, went to a Muslim area or went to outside a mosque or some place like that, and started some sort of a violent activity, which eventually turned into a riot. Even last 2 years, if you've been following news in India, or what happened in Haryana 2 months ago,
Yeah.
Again, the same thing. It was a festival time. They took out a procession and they started heckling the Muslim. They wanted to take the procession out from a Muslim area. They started heckling the Muslims. The Muslims came out, threw stones on them, and the riot broke out. So this pattern has not changed, which is why I feel that the RSS and all its affiliate organizations, whether it is Bajrang Dal or Ram Sene or VHP or so many others, they are all hugely radicalized organizations, which are one of our biggest internal security threats in India today, because our social fabric is so tenuous at the moment that smallest incidents tear it apart. And from city after city, you see smallest incidents blowing up in our faces.
So one quick question here. You mentioned that the person, the head of SIMI, who you knew, who was radicalized but not accepting of the new elements that were coming in, so he quit. So what happened? Has SIMI become a terrorized organization now, or is what has happened?
No, SIMI broke up, and out of that breakup of SIMI emerged a terrorist organization, or which was called Indian Mujahideen, IM. So I'm not aware of SIMI being involved in any activity of violence.
Okay.
But Indian Mujahideen has been found to be involved in acts of violence. A lot of their cadre now is in prison. Many of them have died. So, but in my research, I have not found SIMI per se being involved in any acts of violence.
I get it. Okay, thank you. So one question I have in this context is, your original self-image was, as you said, a woman first, and then a woman who had certain disadvantage as a woman in the social structure, but at the same time, you came from a privileged background, economically privileged background, maybe intellectually a privileged background. So that image, has that changed over time? image of yourself?
Uh, okay. I don't know if my image has changed in my mind, but my image in the way people perceive me has certainly changed, because now one of my biggest identities is not that of a woman, it's that of a Muslim. Uh, my feminine identity has taken a back seat in this new identity, which has been thrust on me of being a Muslim, and maybe a little more articulate Muslim who is talking about Muslim issues. So this has become a more prominent identity. Though ideally I would have wanted to be known and regarded as a woman who writes on issues of national security and defense, which are traditionally not considered the domain of a woman journalist. But I chose to write on these subjects. I chose to specialize in this stream, write on military matters. So ideally, I would have wanted this identity to be more prominent, but it is not.
So that takes me to another question is, in the light of what you just said, why did you write a book about born a Muslim rather than born a woman, or about security issues faced by India?
See, my first book was on security issues. My first
Okay.
book was called Dragon on Our Doorstep.
Yes.
How
About China.
to manage China through military power. That was the first book I wrote. The second book was Born a Muslim. And one of the reasons I wrote this was because I had been writing on issues which would be considered Muslim issues, but when I was writing on those issues, I did not think they were Muslim issues. And I'm talking of issues of terrorism. When this after 9/11 and when the global war on terror started, uh, there was a lot of attention being paid to matters of terrorism, and because of terrorism, on jihad. So I willy-nilly, as part of my job as one of the editors of a magazine on national security and defense, I was writing on terrorism quite regularly, and then I was suddenly faced with the subject of jihad. And I realized almost everybody was talking about jihad, writing about jihad. And I thought maybe because I was also a Muslim, I could have a better perspective on the subject. So that is how I started to comment terrorism in view of what Islam had to say about jihad and the conditionalities associated with jihad. And while I was doing all this research to knowledgeably comment on jihad and terrorism, I learned that actually most of the conflict, or most of the resistance movements that were being labeled as terrorism were political movements. They were movements of political resistance by people who had not been able to find just resolution to their problems. And specific to the Muslim issues, specific to terrorism being carried out by Muslims, I think the core issue that I found were the Palestine issue, the Palestine-Israel issue. And I realized that that had been one of the most motivating or rallying point for Muslims worldwide. I mean, even when organizations like Al-Qaeda sprouted, one of the rallying points was injustice being meted out to the Palestinian people. So while I was researching these things, I realized that actually all fountainheads of what is popularly called terrorism were unresolved political problems. And if these problems were timely and justly resolved, probably they would not have gone out of hand, and probably these acts of terrible violence wouldn't have happened. So that is how I was drawn to this subject. Then putting it on Indian template, I realized that violence in India, when we were talking of jihad in India, only talking in terms of Kashmir issue. And we were talking of Kashmir because, one, it was a Muslim issue, and two, because we thought that Pakistan was abetting terrorism in Kashmir. It was giving moral and material support to the insurgents in Kashmir. So the origin of my book, Born a Muslim, was that. But once I started writing more and more on these issues, then my publisher suggested that why don't I make it a little more broad-based and talk about the Muslim experience in India. And once again, I realized that being a Muslim, I did have a perspective on how Muslims were viewed in India, how they were navigating their lives in India, and what were the challenges. It just so happened that most of my research happened after the present government came in power in 2014. So they give me a lot of material to put in the book.
So I have a question now, because my overall curiosity is to tap into your imagination. That's my personal curiosity.
Okay.
What do you want? How do you see the future that you want to see in India, where there is Muslims and Hindus and people of all religion would live in a kind of zeitgeist that conforms to your imagination? What does that picture look like?
Actually, I would, the picture that I have in mind, maybe it is naive and childish, because this picture comes from what I experienced as a child. And maybe I was an ignorant child, but this is how I viewed my environment when I was growing up, that there was a lot of curiosity among people. My schoolmates were extremely curious people. They would ask me about my Muslim identity. They asked me about what Muslims eat, what they eat, how they live. But I sensed no malice in those questions. I had no inhibition in answering those questions. I would come home and ask my parents that this is what my friend was asking, and my father or my mother would give me a very honest answer, and I would go back the next day and relay that answer to my classmate. So that age of innocence, where if you wanted to understand something about somebody, you would just go and ask that person, and not create your own demons in your own mind about that other person and otherize that person. I think that is what we need. We need to understand each other a little more. We need to be more tolerant towards each other. If we have doubts about others' intentions or others' lifestyle, we should have the confidence and good faith to go and talk to that person. That is,
in the way you responded to my question, I found one very magical word in your answer. And I think I see, from my perspective, I see that as the more actionable imagination of what's possible. You said people were curious. I think curiosity is very innate to human nature. It's not tainted by our beliefs or myths or mythologies. Just like love is a foundational quality of human nature, curiosity is also. And listening to what you said, the way people were not even shy of asking you questions. I read in your book, somebody said, how many mothers do you have? Somebody asked you that question also. So I think it's okay for people to be curious. And then it also made you go to your dad and ask him questions and come back and answer. And that was such an intuitive, natural, innocent way of getting into each other's life, understanding each other's life, and creating a larger consciousness. And I have a concern when we tell people to be secular in its misconstrued way, because now the kind of image of secularism the RSS has projected is its anti-religion. So that's, but secular, tolerant, these ideas get you to do something that is against human nature. Fear is in human nature. And to fight human nature, you can't just say, don't be fearful. But curiosity is also, and I think curiosity, you just gave me a new path to think about this new environment. And because I'm as concerned as you are about how do I reclaim the environment that I have seen in my life, the life that I grew up in as a child, where I had Muslim friends, I had Christian friends, I had Parsi friends, and we would go into each other's homes and look forward to eating stuff that we never got at our house. You know, our Muslim friends of my parents would come during Eid, they would bring us like food that was so amazing. We would wait for a whole year to like get that food. So all that stuff feeds into human nature for curiosity and growing from that richness of unfamiliarity that exists around us. So what do you think out to this? Because I think we are just trying to tell people that they are doing intuitively, and rather than telling them what is possible and comes intuitively.
You know, what is happening today is that there are too many assumptions about the other, and these assumptions have been fed into us continuously through propaganda by going back to this old had that RSS propaganda, that we have eroded curiosity from the minds of the people. They feel that they have all the answers. They know, they feel, or they're convinced that they know everything there is to know about other people, whether it's Muslims or Christians or tribal or even Dalits. So there's this desire to find out the answers, this desire to find answers to your own questions is no longer there, because you feel that you know everything about them, whatever is there to know. And based on these assumptions, you have created such strong walls all around yourself, thinking that you are insulating yourself from them because they are dangerous, without realizing that the walls actually endanger you even more, because the less you know, less you understand, and more you. So actually, the kind of society that we have built today is large number of Muslims. They have no experience of living with Hindus. They have no idea about Hindu festivals, their customs, their eating habits, and a large number of Hindus have no idea about what a Muslim does or eats or behaves like. What are the festivals? Even today, after all this awareness, people say Happy Muharram. So they just do not understand that all festivals or all occasions are not happy occasions. So one would have expected that after so many years of living together, this awareness would be there, but it is not there. I'm not blaming them for that. But the point is, if you do not ask, you will never find out.
Absolutely.
If you only assume, then you will always be wrongly informed.
You know, Shabnam Hashmi has this program called Mere Ghar Aake Bhi To Dekho. You heard about that, right?
I've heard about that, yes.
Yeah. And it seems it's producing some good results, that she's bringing people into each other's homes to essentially for this, to encourage curiosity. The first question is, we talked about being born a Muslim in India. What impact does Islamic terrorism around the world, and I shouldn't call it Islamic terrorism, it is the terrorism, the participation of radical Muslims in terrorism around the world. How does that affect how people treat you here?
See, it only feeds into the prejudice that the mainstream has against the Muslims.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, that I do not believe that there is a thing called terrorism or India has a threat of terrorism at all. I do not agree with that line. Most acts of violence that we have seen around the world, with few exceptions, have been the consequence of unresolved political problems. If those political problems were addressed by the powerful and justly addressed, there would be no violence. I mean, nobody likes getting up in the morning and blowing himself up for no rhyme or reason, no matter how strong your faith is. I mean, you would still want to live with your family, with your parents, your wife, your children. I mean, so the act of radicalization requires a lot of effort. And that effort can only succeed if there is a very strong provocation. And the unresolved political problems provide that provocation. A lot of people give me example of ISIS. Said, oh, look, but they are terrorist organizations. They have no political objective. Uh, Even to ISIS, I would say that if the US had not gone and destabilized Iraq the way it did, there would have been no ISIS. And we all know how Al Qaeda came about. I mean, I don't have to tell you that, it's all public knowledge. So all elements of all radicalized elements, they have been created by big political powers for their short-term objectives, without realizing that this is a genie which, once out of the bottle, will become out of control. And this is what has happened. Now, the fallout of this on Indian Muslims is that we get to hear this regularly, that all Muslims may not be terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. But this is not unique to Muslims. Until 2 decades back, the Sikhs were hearing the same thing. The Sikhs were being labeled with the label of terrorists or Khalistani. Even today, whenever the government or people close to the government find themselves in a corner, they want to label all resistance or political protest by the Sikhs as Khalistani protest. You know what happened during the farmers' protest in North India. Farmers were labeled as Khalistanis. So let's not really take this idea of terrorism very seriously. Our government wants the world to believe that terrorism is the biggest threat to the world. It is the biggest threat to India. And I vehemently disagree with that. I do not think terrorism is a threat to India at all.
That's a very interesting observation. So my last question is, do you have hope, and where does it come from?
I have hope. I have a lot of hope. There are moments of despair when I feel very sad and angry also. But I cannot give up hope, because if I give up hope, then probably I have to just give up living. So hope is that integral to any human being's existence. I mean, it is integral to my existence. So I have a lot of hope. And the biggest source of my hope comes from from this hope that if we have a change of our political dispensation in India, maybe the process of de-radicalization of our society can start. It will not happen overnight, but maybe some process of reconciliation would start. So if, let's say, the BJP doesn't win the next elections, and some other configuration wins the next election, India
Alliance.
association of like-minded people, India, if they win, then maybe they can work towards putting this hate, putting a cap on this hatred, and giving people new ideas to build their aspirations on, instead of just building their aspirations on keeping one or two communities down and hoping that only by keeping them down we can progress. So maybe this mindset would change. And
honestly, history shows any kind of ethnic cleansing doesn't necessarily help solve the problems of the majority population also.
No, not at all. In fact, it worsens their problems. I do not know any example where the problems have been solved at all.
Yes, wonderful. So thank you so much, and I appreciate. I'm going to complete reading your book because I find it fascinating. And thank you for your time.
Thank you for asking me. This is wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Good night. Take care.